Hello everyone. Let's start with the text by Horkheimer and Adorno, Dialectics of Enlightenment. And this text is quite difficult read, so you will have to constantly look for the previous statements and go back to the previous pages to connect what the authors are saying. And then keep in mind certain thematic points and issues so that you can relate the different arguments of the same chapter. So, the major objective of this particular chapter from the text is to provide a genealogical understanding of the concept of enlightenment. They draw from, as mentioned in the previous note that I circulated yesterday, from Kant onwards to Hegel and Marx. And according to them, enlightenment is one particular realm of human thinking through which some notions of emancipation and objectivism is associated, but they try to show the dark side of the reason, and they engage with certain historical narratives along with it, and that's why it is very tedious discussion, sometimes very instrumental and mechanical. But you have to keep in mind that these are the ways through which Horkheimer and Adorno are trying to provide a conceptual genealogy of the Enlightenment. So they explain why we should talk about modern scientific reason and why the formation of this particular reason is uh, also irrational at times, and it also comes under the control of or is paired with, in some sense, to a reason that is substantive to human needs. But they focus on the structure of rational thought and how far it is related to the pre-modern thinking, which is not considered as rational. So what makes a thinking or logic rational and uh, scientific, they will try to keep that in mind. So they they are basically engaging with the whole model of positivism, and they were trying to understand how before the emergence of modern positivism the forms of thinking cognition had already been like reduced to a different normative thing and thinking also. So according to them, the triumph of instrumental reason begins with the hegemony of modern science over human knowing, that any claimed cognition that cannot be further translated into science is not considered as some form of cognitive rationality or thinking. Uh, and they also simultaneously want you to think that how uh, instrumental reason then attaches all the efforts to increase capital as well as to bind the whole of the social science to its own ends, right? And that is where they want to relate that how instrumental reason emerges from its very beginnings in the form of abstract universality, that there is some unchanging structure of this natural world, and this is sensuous world and it operates in concrete singularity, and that is when they try to pose the dialectics of uh, science, reason, enlightenment, and myth, irrationality, and moral, and so on. So they want to dwell on this particular discussion on positive philosophy of science. And according to them, this modern instrumental scientific consciousness is the main source of the cultural decline, as a result of which humanity is sinking into a new kind of barbarism. So, in the first part of the chapter, you will find there is a discussion on enlightenment, and the chapter provides a initial ground for the critique of positivism, and then this is elaborated upon by critique of science and technology, and later on they argue that how this positivist narrative works as an ideology, and it makes possible and help to constitute new forms of domination. So this another important issue of the same chapter is to later relate the enlightenment as a form of mass deception. I had circulated a PDF day before yesterday, so you can also see some of the discussion there. And here they are not exactly following Marx, who would say that the ruling ideas in every age are the ideas of the ruling class, and the modern technology has expanded the reach of the ideas, and the ideas are implanted in the society at large. But they want to argue that technology and technological consciousness have themselves produced a new phenomena in the form of mass culture, which then silences critique, which silences any alternative imagination. And the full scale development of this thought you will find in Herbert Marcuse, whose text called One Dimensional Man, which means that when we discard any forms of critique from our social and political imagination, we are left with only one dimensional thinking about the system. So that you have to only think about positive sides of a system, and you cannot criticize, you cannot provide any alternative. So it's a mechanical reproduction of means of production, and constantly producing certain goods to advance scientific capitalist interests. In first chapter, if you just open the first chapter of the page of the chapter, first page of the chapter, he writes, Enlightenment, understood in the widest sense as the advance of thought, has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters. Now they want to pose a question here. And what is the question? They are saying, why do humans propose mythic accounts of the world in the first place? Now this is the question that we need to begin with. And why is it that enlightenment always aims to liberate human beings from the fear? Horkheimer and Adorno think and argue that fear of overwhelming and threatening nature, right? So the natural world is perceived as a threat and fearful. Now this is one of the major motives behind the efforts of human knowing, that you want to know the world. So let's read a paragraph from the text, so you get an idea why they are arguing about the fear. In the first paragraph, they say that yet the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with the triumphant calamity. Enlightenment's program was the disenchantment of the world. It wanted to dispel myths, to overthrow fantasy with knowledge. Bacon, the father of experimental philosophy, brought these motives together. He despised the exponents of tradition who substituted belief for knowledge and were as unwilling to doubt as they were reckless in supplying answers. So he builds on this discussion, and then on page number 2, middle of the paragraph, they write, what human beings seek to learn from nature is how to use it to dominate only both it and human beings. Nothing else counts. Ruthless towards itself, the Enlightenment has eradicated the last remnants of its own self awareness. Only thought which does violence to itself is hard enough to shatter myths. Faced by the present triumph of the factual mentality, Bacon's nominalist credo would have smacked of metaphysics and would have been convicted of the same vanity for which he criticized scholasticism. Power and knowledge are synonymous. Long back Foucault, Adorno and Horkheimer writing that power and knowledge are synonymous. What is the underlying issue here? Authors are trying to bring out that enlightenment is considered a systematic process through which the human beings and human societies' ignorance is dispelled and new forms of thinking about itself, about the world, which is critical, which is based on rationality, another form of reasoning, which is then stabilized and established as the characteristics of modern thinking. And it is posed as a challenge to the mythical understanding. And they are building upon a dialectical thinking, and they are trying to understand that how one thing which then out of the process of dialectic develops into what it is not. So something develops into the opposite of it, and that's how they want to uh, discuss that how myth finally failed and myth got developed into enlightenment. But again, because of the instrumental reasoning of the enlightenment itself, now we are experiencing the process through which enlightenment itself is turning into another form of mythical reasoning. So on page number 11, there is a very interesting paragraph where he writes in the middle of the page number 11, yes. The concept usually defined as the unity of the features of what it subsumes was rather from the first a product of dialectical thinking in which each thing is what it is only by becoming what it is not. That's a contradiction of the thesis antithesis, something of that sort. This was the primal form of the objectifying definition in which concept and thing became separate. The same definition which was already far advanced in the Homeric epic and trips over its own excesses are in modern positive science. And he says after a few statements, the gods cannot take away fear from human beings, the petrified cries of whom they bear as their names. Humans believe themselves free of fear when there is no longer anything unknown. Right? And this they think is the central motive behind the whole paradigm of enlightenment. They wanted to know how the world works from a particular vantage point, because they had the threat and fear of the unknown things about natural world. And that's why they say that this process has led to the determination of demythologization of enlightenment, which equates the living with non-living, as myth had equated the non-living with the living. Enlightenment then for them is a mythical fear radicalized. It's a very dialectical thinking. And they argue that the pure immanence of positivism is ultimate product is nothing other than a form of universal taboo, which means that once you are within the paradigm of enlightenment modern instrumental thinking, It aims to capture and bring everything, every form of social life, economic life, personal life, natural life into its own fold. So nothing remains outside of it. Everything is known, everything has a reason, everything has a certain cause and effect explanations, and whatever is left out of it is the cause of fear, is the real source of fear. And that is why enlightenment always quells any, dispels any such belief or validation or recognition of myths. By explaining how things work, it destroys the myth. So the relation between myth and reason, instrumental reason, is important because it also tells us the way knowledge is formed. It also tells us the way how within the enlightenment modern scientific thinking, uh, uh, every experience is detached from the living being and it is objectivized. So it actually desubjectivizes the experience and makes it a worldly thing. For example, the whole idea of concept formation, of turning things into knowledge, the actual living and biting animal, let's call it an animal like cat or dog, they are then turned into a non-living concept about the dog, and we have the concept called a concept of cat family, right? And this is very at conceptual discussion. So the authors are trying to tell us that how concept formation about the world, about the process through which things change, later on got detached from the process and the actual empirical referent, and they got turned in themselves into an objective term, concept, and abstract. So that's where there is a linkage between universality and particularity. So concepts become universal so that they are able to communicate the same meaning to every person. For example, the concept of a dog has a universal meaning. Yes, there are different species of the dog, but the concept of dog remains the same, that it is an animal which has four legs, two eyes, two ears, and it barks. Right? So there is a particular definition and uniqueness attached to this concept of dog, which is not, which is universal in the sense, and which is abstract and generalized. And but this concept of dog doesn't mean any specific dog. It is a very generalized referent. So this is how we control individual reference of a particular object or concept. Okay, how do we talk about enlightenment led demythologization? This is very important to understand Adorno and Horkheimer's position in this chapter. This is a critical process actually through which any feature of experience which depends upon subjective experience for its reality is eliminated. Because it is not real. Right? Again, I'm saying enlightenment's led demythologization means a critical process through which any feature of experience which depends upon subjective experience for its reality is to be eliminated as less than fully real. And the dominant form of scientific knowledge is genealogically bound to its formation out of the fear of unknown, and that's how the desire for control and mastery, even at its heights, scientific knowledge is the drive to self-preservation in rational form. This is how many different group of scholars have understood the whole desire to develop scientific thought, because of the fear of human beings, that how nature works. That was the fear. So we want to systematize everything, we want to organize everything, we want to have scientific laws about everything, we want to have universal laws about every practice, every process, every uh, phenomena in the world. And then science follows that the same method of negation and overcoming of the naturally given structure, uh, naturally given can structure the rational morality. And now this idea of negation is also important to understand their position, because they were trying to that pose that there are similarly underlying mechanisms of rationalization that enjoin the mathematization of nature and the procedures through which then economy functions, and that's where Marx comes in. So there are mechanisms of rationalization through which we understand the natural world, natural phenomena, natural life. We systematize the thought. Then we kind of create certain categories, formulas, and we have something called mathematization of the nature, natural life. Now this knowledge then is related to the procedure of capitalist production. That's where Marx comes in, where every qualitative use value must be quantified into an exchange value. Now this process through which the natural life is turned and converted into an exchange value is the backdrop of capitalist production. So then this process further the mechanisms of supply and demand of goods, of the money comes in. And recall our discussions on George Simmel and his idea of why anonymity functions in a certain manner, and how money in urban spaces depersonalize, create certain blaze attitude, right? So it's a uh, process through which economy as a whole becomes very complex and a very law governing machine. And the broad thesis then in this particular discussion is that the instrumental rationality has now become total in their account of social, cultural, and political life. And it integrates all forms and differences into one, and it actually destroys any differences and diversities. And that's how it becomes a mechanism for control and domination, and the control and domination is total then. Try to read the first 10 pages and see if you are able to make sense of this, because there are so many references of different philosophical moments, certain events, authors, and hypotheses. So you have to bring all that together so that it makes sense to you, and share your questions, concerns.